Good day, this is Kevin from PersonMakeObject World Headquarters. Before we get into making a handle, I have a little background and a disclaimer. First, the background. Matt Estley designed and made this knife before I did. Matt and his producer Rob have created a ton of high quality content on tools and techniques, materials and methods, projects and plans. Check him out at mattesley.com and on YouTube. I wanted to buy one of Matt's knives, but he was out of stock for a long time. Matt's all about sharing and inspiring others to make, so I figured he was okay with me trying to make my own. I made the first one crudely with inefficient tools, but the end product was pretty nice. I decided to make a few for friends, so bought new tools so that I could make them better. Now I'm making small batches of knives and hardware kits, basically to recoup the cost of new tools. So Matt, if you see this, thanks for inspiring others and sharing. I've sent you one of the knives and I'd love to hear what you think of it. Cheers, mate. Now the disclaimer. I'm not a wood turner. I sometimes use a lathe if I need a roundish object, but I make up terminology I don't know. I'm sure I use tools wrong, and I probably have terrible techniques and bad practices. I'm sure there's other ways to make this handle that are probably superior to how I'm making them. So show me what you make, how you make it, tag me on Instagram, email me at personmakeobject@gmail.com. All right, let's see the tools and materials we need to make the handle.
In addition to a lathe, you'll need a hardware kit. You'll need turning blanks sufficiently sized for the size and shape of handle that you want to turn. The handles I make are 9/16 inch in diameter by 6 inches long, so my blanks are about 8 inches long by 5/7 inch square. This gives me sufficient material to hold on to as I turn all the parts I need to turn. You'll need something to hold your stock. I use a 4-jaw chuck with spigot jaws, but you can turn between centers. You'll just have to work out some work holding issues slightly differently than I do in the demo. You'll need a live center,
a drill chuck with a 3/16 diameter drill bit.
You'll need turning tools. I use a skew, a parting tool, and a detail gouge. You may use a roughing gouge or carbide tools depending on the shape of your handle. You'll need some measuring tools. I use a ruler and a pencil. If you have a dial or a digital caliper, it can be very helpful in getting the precise fit between the parts. You can also use mechanical dividers or just friction fit the pieces. You'll need abrasives. I work from 150 grit up to 800 grit. And you'll need finish if you're applying it on the lathe. I just apply several coats of wax to the handles. If you use a hard oil or a friction polish, that'll look great too. Let's take a closer look at the hardware kit and the intersection between the handle and the hardware.
In your kit, you'll find 5 Swan Morton craft knife blades. These are made in Great Britain, but they're readily available on Amazon and eBay. Blades also come in a few shapes. You can buy a box of 50 for about 20 bucks. There's a set screw and an Allen key, there's a blade cover, and there's your blade holder parts. The blade holder consists of a ferrule and a body. The outer diameter of the body is 9 millimeters. The ferrule is 9 millimeters inside and either 10 millimeters or 11 millimeters outside diameter. The ferrule is 2 millimeters longer than the body, so when it slides over, you wind up with a shoulder that has to be 2 millimeters long. So if we look at our handle, we have a 3/16 diameter hole that's 1.25 inches deep. The tang slides into the handle. Shoulder is the same diameter as the body and 2 millimeters long, so that when the ferrule slides over the body, lines up flat against the shoulder. The outer part of the shoulder can either be flush or it can be larger than the diameter of the ferrule, and that's sort of a design preference for you. I turn them down to about 10.5 or 11 millimeters, and then I sand it ever so slightly with the finer grits of sandpaper to get a slight radius on this shoulder, just to soften the transition between the handle and the ferrule. I think we can finally chuck some wood in a lathe. Okay, I've got my blank chucked up into my 4-jaw chuck, a 3/16 diameter drill bit in my drill chuck. If you're turning between centers, really the only thing you have to do differently is drill that hole on a drill press, and then you can turn between centers. This hole is 1.25 inches deep.
And once I get the hole drilled, I can just switch to a live center. My live center happens to have an interchangeable tip, and I got extremely lucky, and the diameter of this interchangeable tip is 10 millimeters, which is the same as the outside diameter of the ferrule. So this becomes a great reference diameter for me, and if I turn this end down to the diameter of my live center, I'm basically at the diameter of that end of my blank, of my handle. The first thing I usually do at this point is use one of my existing handles just as a template. I give myself roughly 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters on the blade holder end to cut that shoulder in, and I just mark out the length and give myself, you know, 1/4 inch of extra, just in case something goes wrong here when I'm cutting this shoulder. I can just shift everything down toward the headstock. Now I'll use my parting tool to give myself some clearance on the butt end of the handle. And I'll turn this down close to the same as the blade holder end, just because, like my livestock diameter, this just gives me a nice layout, and it's easy for me to see the profile that I'm going to cut. I cut the profile of my handle mostly with a skew. I don't really know why. As I said, I'm not a turner, and I pick up tools and see what they do, and the first time I made this, I made it with the skew, and it just worked really well. I've got some muscle memory, and this goes pretty quickly. So once I have the general handle shape that I've been making, I'm going to cut the shoulder. Obviously, you might be making a different shaped handle. Probably not idea to have a number of blocks. They don't always go as you plan, and sometimes you're going to iterate a little bit on the lathe. So at the blade holder end, we're going to cut that 9 millimeter diameter shoulder. I cut it long and chuck it in a no-mar sleeve later on to trim it to length, because it's difficult at this point to cut the shoulder at exactly 2 millimeters because we're awfully close to that live center. So I just cut it long and trim it later. This is also a point where if I don't hit 9 millimeters the first time I cut that shoulder, I can push everything back a little further. Or, of course, just make the handle shorter. Always an option. That's 904. That's going to be awfully close. I'll often test fit with the ferrule. Make sure, look at that. Lucky, lucky me. Alright, so, sanding. We are ready to sand. I'm going to take the ferrule off. So I sand starting with 100 grit and work my way up to 800 or even 9 micron. I've sanded down to 320 grit. Before I go any further, I'm going to give the butt end most of its profile. Again, I'm using an existing handle as a template, marked by butt end. I'm going to use my parting tool to turn that radius down and give myself some clearance again, and then I'm going to use my detail gouge to just roll the back end of that down to about 1/4 of an inch diameter. At this point, before I get any narrower, I would refine the shape. Right now, the butt end of this handle is a little bit fatter than most of the handles that I've made, but they're not all the same. I'm making a person-made object here. I'm not a robot, so we'll let this one go. I'm going to work my way up to 400, 800, and then 9 micron abrasive. On this handle, the shoulder to the ferrule I got very lucky, and it was very, very close. Sometimes this shoulder will be slightly larger than the diameter of the ferrule, and I might put the ferrule on sooner in order to radius off that shoulder. In this case, I was really quite flush, so I can just put it on when I switch to the 9 micron abrasive, just to polish that ferrule up. Alright, we are ready for finishing. For darker, somewhat porous woods, I'll often use a pigmented wax to fill the grain a bit. And I'll do 2 or 3 coats of this wax, letting it dry in between. If you want a little more luster, you can also give it a shot of friction polish. The last step on the lathe will be parting it off, which I just do with the detail gouge. Roll that butt end. Give myself a bit more clearance beforehand if necessary. Alright, at this point I am done except for trimming the length of the shoulder and finishing up the butt end. For that, I go directly into my chuck. I don't know if this is a no-one Turner's thing or if my discovery is going to blow the minds of wood turners everywhere. But I put it into a piece of Tygon vinyl tubing, which serves as a fantastic protective sleeve so that I can trim the length of that tenon and also finish the butt end. So that tenon is roughly 2 millimeters. They may vary ever so slightly. And the way I transfer the depth to my workpiece is to put my blade holder together, and ideally I would put the set screw back into that hole. I just have this little depth finding ruler that I slide into the hole, and there I have a little depth stop, which I can use to transfer that dimension onto that shoulder. And then use my parting tool to cut it to length. That's probably a no-no, but I use the parting tool to clean out the inside of the hole and put a chamfer on it. So, my blade holder slides into the hole and butts up against the end of the tenon. My collet slides over the holder and over that shoulder. If I clean it up just a little bit more, I think I have a bit of a burr preventing me from taking that out. Voila. Last thing, I can unchuck the assembled knife, turn it around, and just finish up the butt end. Hit it with some abrasive to get rid of my nub that was left off from parting it. So for this handle, the next step is making the flats on the side, which are parallel to and are a reference for the angle of the blade. For your handle, that may be different. But there we have it. I'd love to see the shapes and materials that you come up with and any variations of these techniques. To glue my blade holder into my handle, I've taken the blade holder apart and I'm just using some 2-part epoxy. This is like a 15-minute epoxy. 5-minute you could probably get away with. I do these in batches, so I use a little longer open time on my epoxy. You don't need a ton for this. Mix it up good. I apply epoxy in the inside of the hole. Just kind of coat the inside portion of that hole. You don't need a ton. You don't want a whole lot of epoxy to get squeezed out of this. So if you don't have some depth to your hole and you apply too much epoxy, you'll have a mess on your hands. Take apart your fail. When you do this, note that due to my less than perfect manufacturing equipment and processes, I'm still dialing this in. The hole in the ferrule may not be perfectly centered, so check whether or not the ferrule lines up flush with the end of the blade holder, and make a note on that end of the ferrule so that when you put it together, it's pointing the right way. I put some epoxy on the tang of the blade holder. I put it together. I'm pretty tight. I've got a vacuum fit here, and I don't have too much epoxy squeezing out of that hole. I'm going to check my grain direction and get it in an orientation that I like. Since I'm going to put flats on these handles later on, I tend to have the V of the wood grain, if it's that type of wood, parallel
or sort of, I guess, perpendicular to the blade. The flat sides will be machined on these sides. That looks good. I'm going to just take a rag and wipe off a bit of the epoxy that squeezed out of there. And at this point, I feel like I actually have a good amount of epoxy on that shoulder there, so that when I put the ferrule on, and there you can see my directional indicator of which is the end of the ferrule and which goes against the shoulder. Slide that all together and put your set screw in to make sure that it lines up. If you can grab your set screw, if your set screw doesn't run away from you. If the depth of your shoulder isn't perfect, this will make sure that the body and the ferrule are properly lined up. So there we have it. We have finally completed our PersonMakeObject craft knife handle kit. Wipe off that extra excess. I'd probably put this on the lathe one more time after it dries and let it set up or polish it up before I gave it to a friend or went to work cutting some dovetails or whatever. Thanks so much for supporting my making. Check out Matt Esley's YouTube page and his web page. Thank you, Matt. Amazing stuff. Keep up the great work. I will probably publish another little video of how I flatten the sides on this later on. But this has been a lot, and I got other things to do. Gonna make some more handle kits. So take care. Thanks so much. Be well.